MessianTics podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now, here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the MessianTics podcast. We're sitting here talking about what we wanted to talk about, and as we were trying to brainstorm and think through, we actually came to the realization, and not literally realization because we've all been preparing for it for our congregations and such, but Pesach, Passover is just around the corner. We're about a month away from Pesach, and we wanted to just dive into a conversation of about Pesach and where it goes. We don't really know. We've got a couple of different ideas floating around from how we personally in our own homes observe Pesach and different how we interact with different traditions about removing chametz or leavening from our lives, and the same in our own congregations and beyond that. But we especially want to touch on some of the relational aspect between Messianic Judaism and the rest of the body of Messiah with regards to Pesach and Easter, because there can a lot of times be some contention, whether legit or created, some contention there in our interaction and involvement with the rest of the body that probably is not healthy and shouldn't be there. But nonetheless, we're going to dive into that today, and we hope that this is a blessing of a conversation for you. And I'm going to throw it out there. Who wants to run with it?
So I know one of the things that we do that when I first started doing it years ago is kind of funny, but I mean it's a perfectly legitimate way of now doing things. Was my wife and I have a toaster oven, and there's just no way you're cleaning a toaster oven to the degree you would want it to be cleaned, I guess. Because, there's so many little grooves and crevices in the heater units and the bottom and everything. So I'm sure there's crumbs and ashes at this point of, the leaven remaining. So what we would do is we would bag the thing up in a trash bag, put it in like a Rubbermaid tote, and put the thing outside the house. And so it was literally like outside of any kind of fence or walled enclosure, signifying that, no, this is not ours. This does not belong to us. We have purged our home and our gates from all leaven. And I know Catherine and Abigail, when they were roommates years ago, they would do something similar in their apartments. They would, because the apartment complex, I'm thinking of Abigail and another roommate later on. They would just stick it out back because their apartments are all disjointed from the other apartment buildings. So you walk out of your apartment and you're immediately on a sidewalk, but you're outside of your doors and gates or whatever. So they would do this very similar thing, put it in a tote bin and just be like right outside the back door, and no one really should mess with it, but
which is not unrealistic, because even in traditional Jewish homes, it's especially you would have Passover dishes, right? You have your regular dishes for the year, and then you have your Passover dishes. And as you're prepping for Passover, you remove your regular dishes from the house and you put out your Passover dishes, and that's all that's used. It's the same concept. And then after Passover, you flop them around. You bring back out your regular. One of my favorite things and I talk about this kind of half jokingly, but I also think it's kind of a real problem that exists in the way we kind of think about things within Judaism sometimes, is the idea of it's pretty common that people will clear their house out of chametz from Passover and anything they may have in their pantry. They'll put into a box, and they'll take it over to their neighbor and sell it to their neighbor for a couple of bucks or what have you. And then the neighbor holds on to it, and then after Passover, you go back and you redeem it. You buy it back and you bring it back because you've already spent the money on it. Why throw it away when it's perfectly good and whatever? And that's always been one of those things that I've thought was just kind of kooky, because especially as believers, now, outside of Messianic Judaism, it is what it is, but especially as believers, we see the symbolic connection that the scripture makes between chametz and sin. Not that eating chametz is sin, but the clearing of chametz out of our house is symbolic of clearing sin out of our lives. And my kind of take with it was always, why would we want to take this sin, symbolic imagery of sin out of our lives, and then after Passover be like, okay, I'm going to bring this back in now.
Go get it back.
I'm going to go recollect my sin and make sure I have, we all know you're going to end up buying more chametz anyways and what have you. So, but it's just the imagery of the act. And so for us in our household, one of the things we've always done is it doesn't matter how much chametz we have left. Usually about a month before Pesach, we'll start digging through cabinets and taking all the chametz, putting it in a box or something in the kitchen where it's just out in the open and obvious, and we're like, all right, eat this crap first. Doesn't matter what else is in the house, let's blow through this crap first so that we're not wasting money. But if there's anything left when it's time to clear out for Passover, we actually just throw it all away entirely. And then if we buy new stuff after Passover, that's one thing. But for us in our household, it's always been a thing where we're like, the imagery of let's get rid of sin in our lives and start fresh, and what have you, has always been a really kind of powerful imagery in our life and practice in our home.
Yeah, at our house, my wife will go through and I'll help her get all the stuff out of the cupboards and out of the pantry. By eating it. And we'll put it on the table. And then about 2 weeks to 3 weeks before Passover, any of the stuff that's boxed up, closed box still, we'll give away to our neighbors if we're not going to be able to eat it, because I don't like to just throw it away. But if you do it a couple weeks before, then the chances are they'll eat it before Passover, so you're not just giving your yeast to somebody to hold until after Passover, but we give it away, or we give it to the homeless shelter or something like that. It's funny, just on a side note, for years, people would come to my house and they would bring a bottle of wine to come to dinner, and Pammy and I don't drink that much wine, and so we would end up with bottles of wine sitting in our cupboard, which we would have to pour out before Pesach because of the yeast in the wine, unless it was kosher for Passover wine, but most of the time it's not. So
you didn't have a pre-Passover schnookered party?
We did not have a pre-Passover schnookered party, which is, I guess, why Purim comes before Passover, so that. But anyhow, that's a side conversation. But so I made a statement one time at synagogue. I said, "Look, I appreciate people coming to the house to visit for dinner or whatever, and bringing a bottle of wine, but we don't drink that much wine. So if you're going to bring something, bring rum, because rum isn't made out of one of the species that you have to get rid of at Passover." And then all of a sudden we got inundated with rum. Now, we don't drink that much rum either. But it was just funny that became this regular thing.
Now people get you rum all the time.
Yeah, birthdays and anniversaries and Hanukkah and all so now I have a cabinet full of rum instead of wine, but at least I don't have to pour it out.
You still have those big ones?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Those big bottles have been unopened for like 4 years, I think, going on. Something like that.
We just clean it out and throw it away. I think the best thing to probably do is just to prepare as Passover comes, just to maybe buy less and less. I'm not. I do like the idea of giving it to a charity, because that's a situation where there's some grace and some mercy, and I wouldn't be comfortable giving, even if they didn't celebrate Passover. I wouldn't bring my leaven over to someone's house and say, well, I don't want this in my house because I'm trying to honor God, but you can take it.
Right.
I never liked that.
Right.
It's problematic. I think if you have I understand, that in some cases, Jewish community, I'm not talking about Messianic Judaism, but like Judaism in general, they can be in some cases very insular. So I don't like the view. I've never liked it, which we've talked about it a lot of times on here, which is this idea of, well, the nations can do that stuff. The Gentiles can do that stuff. We don't do that though, because it's our very special responsibility to be the best people we can be, but the nations can do whatever they want. It's kind of like I once heard a interview with an Orthodox Jewish person. He was Orthodox, he's not Messianic, but he was. They said, "Well, how do you feel?" A Christian was asking him, "How do you feel about me believing in Jesus?" He goes, "Well, you can do that." And he was like, "Right, but you don't do it. That you don't think that's a good thing." He goes, "It's not good for me." And he's like, but you think that's okay for me? And he's like, yeah. He goes, well, the problem I have with that is like, if you're doing the best you can and you know what's right, wouldn't you want me to know what's right so I'll be okay? He goes, well, no, you don't have to worry about that because you're not Jewish. So I don't like the idea of I like the idea of giving it to where there could be a need where at least somebody's getting fed. There's like a life over law type thing kind of happening in there. Selling it or giving it away and then buying it back, that is so ridiculously inconvenient.
Yeah, it also reminds me of the Shabbos Goy. It drove me crazy even as a child that the scripture said, obey the Sabbath, your male servant, maid servant, all. Yeah. But you have a Gentile come and do all the things on Shabbat that you're not allowed to do because they're a Gentile. And I think that it diminishes the value of God's creation and the importance of things. And the same way where if you take your chametz out your house and you sell it to your Gentile next door, to me it's doing exactly the same thing.
The amount of effort and if you're a Messianic Jewish or Gentile person that does that, then this is what I'm saying to you. The amount of effort that you're putting into taking your chametz over to your neighbor's house, why don't you either share them the gospel or invite them to your Seder instead of giving them your chametz? Because that's ridiculous. I know I'm sounding a little... That's just, to me, that is so insulting. And even if the person doesn't take it as an insult, yeah, sure, you can leave it in my garage. It's really insulting. You're saying, hey, my spiritual betterment is more important than yours. So take this chametz. Just throw the crap away or burn it or give it to someone who needs to eat right now.
To a lesser extent, it would be the same if, like, you came to faith and you had a bunch of porn. Yeah. And you decided, I'm not going to watch porn anymore, but here, let me give it to my next door neighbor.
Let me give my magazines.
Because they're already going to hell, videos. So what difference does it make?
Right. Yeah. No, that's a ridiculous practice. And if I had a conversation with a Messianic person that did that, like, yeah, I just give it to my neighbor, I'm like, that's really, I'm like, you're kind of following, I think that's a bad attitude in Judaism. I think that's not. I think that kind of stuff is like what Messianic Judaism should be getting away from. You should be away from that, like, because that's like that's an outmoded Jewish way of thinking, which is just, let's just give it to the goy because they don't do this stuff, and we're supposed to do it, and they don't have to do it, and they'll have a place in the world to come. They'll sweep the floor or something. It's just the attitude that you're projecting. Now, I'm not making that up.
No,
I'm getting that from, that's poor behavior.
Yeah.
Just use your effort to gather up your chametz and truck it over to somebody's house and just say, you know what, I'm going to throw it away. Hey, you want to come to my Seder? Hey, you know who Yeshua is? Or there's so much better stuff you can do than just give them all your dang bread and say, I'll be back next week.
From a Bisquick mix.
Yeah.
So I just think that's dumb.
And whether you're talking about chametz literally or figuratively as a representation of sin, doing that, in essence, what you're saying is, here, hold this sin that's not good enough for my life, but you hang on to it because God doesn't really care about your life anyways.
And I'll be back for my sin next week.
Yeah.
It's just a temporary relinquishment. I'm gonna come back for it, but you don't matter anyways. So you hold on to it.
That is so, in a bad way. That's bad religion. When I say that the problem with religion, that kind of stuff, because there's beautiful things about religion, but that is bad. That's what's bad about religion. You're being religious in such a bad way by doing that. Yeah,
it diminishes the value of God's creation. He created all of us, regardless of whether we were born Jewish or not. And we're supposed to be a light to the nations, and you don't be a light to the nations by taking your darkness and giving it to them, even if it's just a symbolic effort. It's just wrong. So I think all of us, like I said, my wife is kind of funny about this stuff because she'll start going through the cabinets and diminishing stuff in January because she knows April's coming. So, we start limiting the amount of bread and bread products and yeast products and stuff that come into the house at that time. And in preparation, so we don't have that much left to go over. So But we all do that. We all prepare our homes for that. She does the whole spring cleaning thing and vacuums everything and pulls all the cushions off the couches and makes sure she gets any crumbs that were there and all of those things as she prepares. But
bringing a torch and kasha your kitchen for Pesach.
Yeah, we just do the whole thing. It's just, but beyond preparing the house for chametz, getting the chametz out the house. Do you guys, I'm just curious, do you have separate dishes that you use just for Pesach Seder, or do you use your regular dishes? Do you use special...
I'm going to be honest, just speaking in my household, we hate doing dishes if we don't have to. 9 times out of 10, we're eating on paper plates. I'm not even going to lie. Disposable plates are glorious. But no, we wash dishes. So, I understand that there's no chametz left on it. I get the symbolic gesture of special plates and dishes and all of this. I get it. But I also know how, sanitary procedures work and that there's no chametz left on that plate. So, no, I don't have special dishes just for. And my wife may sometimes pull out, the china for Pesach just to make the table look a little better. But that's about as special of special dishes as we have for that.
Yeah, we've used nice china and stuff, and we've used paper plates. I think that now I don't feel as strongly about if somebody is very careful about their plates. Like we have Passover plates. I think that's really sweet, and I think that if you're applying that kind of meaning, it's kind of like if you apply special meaning to your Passover china. I think that's really beautiful. But if I invited you to my Seder and you turned your nose up at my paper plates, you have a problem.
Yeah, I think a real big thing, and this is something I talk about when it comes to Shabbat also. Mm-hmm. If your preparations for Shabbat takes all the joy out of Shabbat, then your preparations are a problem. Yep. In other words, if you
have to hate what you're doing to get ready for Shabbat,
right? If you're miserable by the time Shabbat comes because you had all the effort to make this special meal and this special this and this special that and get out the right dishes and then you're miserable through Shabbat, then you're not celebrating Shabbat. Just use paper plates and plastic forks and knives and enjoy your Shabbat.
And have takeout delivered.
That's the difference between legalism and joy.
Yeah.
You can do exactly the same thing, but if your heart's not right in doing it, if it's about a drudgery and I have to do this or I can't have Shabbat, I would rather have grilled cheese sandwiches for Shabbat than a big feast if it meant my wife was going to enjoy entering the Shabbat with me.
And I know that this episode is technically about Pesach, but since you brought up entering Shabbat with the right heart and all, that's precise. And I can't speak for Bradam because you guys have been around a lot longer and I never asked you, but that's precisely why CMC doesn't do Erev Shabbat services. We do Shabbat morning services instead of evening because growing up in a congregation that did Erev Shabbat services and having been in the movement for most of my life, one of the things I've noticed is Erev Shabbat services tend to start somewhere between 7:30 and 8:30. They're a little later because it depends on the time of year when sun goes down, so you just have them later so you're safe either way. But the service would start, say 7:30, 8 o'clock. And so if you work a regular work week and you get off at 5 o'clock on Friday, now you've got to rush home, you've got to rush to change clothes, you've got to rush to grab food on the way to synagogue, you've got to rush to get to synagogue to be able to go to service. So you're not entering Shabbat with joy and gladness, with peace, with, you're entering with stress and anxiety and anger and annoyance and whatever else. Not to mention that an evening service tends to start around a kid's bedtime. Right? Most little kids are going to bed at 7:30, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, whatever. Right. It's starting around their bedtime. So now parents can't enjoy Shabbat because they're in synagogue looking at all of the dirty looks they're getting because their kids who are supposed to be in bed right now are are up past their bedtime and are not behaving because that's just kids that are up too late. That's how they act. It's a natural part of being a kid. And everybody looks at them judgmentally. And so now parents are stressed out and anxious and whatever. I can't see a way that you can have an Erev Shabbat service as a congregation that allows for people to come in peacefully, unless it's literally nothing but retired people who aren't rushing from work and who don't have kids they got to worry about. And that's one thing. Like, if that works, then go for it. But for us and our identity as a congregation, we're like, we aren't doing Erev Shabbat services because it just doesn't allow for that peaceful.
Yeah, and that's the same reason we don't do it. We want people to have an enjoyable Shabbat with their family and maybe invite some friends over to have a peaceful Shabbat. And that carries over to Pesach.
Yeah, Pesach
you
Seder,
know, the reality for Pesach, we're told, have matzah, have bitter herbs, and the lamb, which we can't offer now. So really, it's matzah, bitter herb. That's it. That we're commanded. The wine, all that stuff is additional tradition that tells a story and all that. And if you have Passover with your family, and you have a 3-hour Haggadah-led Seder, where everybody is miserable and the kids are miserable, the family's miserable, then you're just ruining Passover.
Right.
Passover. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't have a 3-hour Seder, or that you shouldn't follow the Haggadah, or that you shouldn't do the traditions.
There's ways to do it with joy. If you watch, for instance, a Hasidic Seder, like, they're banging on the table, they're singing out, they're boisterous, there's intentionality in joy and worship as they're singing the songs and they're working through the Haggadah and so on. It's all about, it comes down to the discussion of Keva and Kavanah. Keva is the defined order and structure to things, and Kavanah is what's your heart's intention. Yeah. Like, how are you? The Kavanah allows for there to be variance in the Keva, so that your heart's in the right place as you're doing these things. And when it comes to your Pesach Seder, and this is, and I know you guys, if I remember correctly, you guys aren't doing a congregational Seder still currently, right? So in our congregational Seder is a big part of what we do. Now, you guys, when you eliminated your congregational Seder a few years back, it actually forced us to rethink, why is it we do one? And is it an outreach thing, or is it what was our reasoning for it? Is it to try and lure people to the congregation? What was the purpose? And so we actually came to the conclusion that our Seder as a congregation, though it has an outreach mode to it, and though it has an introductory mode to Messianic Judaism, to Maim Chaim, to it, those weren't our primary purposes. Our primary purpose was to get our community, our mishpocha, together for Seder. And so we never do our Seder on the first or second night. It's always later in the week, so that, and we encourage people to have Seders on the first night and or second night of Passover at home, and invite friends and family, invite other congregants, invite whatever, and do it up big at home and have a good time with it and celebrate. But then we do a big Seder together for the congregation, so that as a community, we're able to all do it together. And then it doubles down, and we have people that invite friends and family and non-believing Jewish people and others from the outside that come into it. It ends up being a lot bigger than just our congregation. But we calculated that our purpose wasn't growth. It was not numerical growth. It was spiritual growth, being able to do that together. And so we encourage people, just like Shabbat, Pesach, first night, second night, spend that at home with your friends and family, or invite it over to, don't invite yourself over, but invite it over to somebody else's home for Passover. Invite non-believing friends over, etc., and do it up right, but celebrate it at home with gladness and joy in your heart and so on. And then in a couple of days, we'll all get together as a community and do a big Seder, and it's really beautiful, and everybody loves it. Everybody gets involved to help set up breakdown, which is great. We've kind of got that down to an art now, where the Seder ends, and within an hour we're all headed home from breakdown, which is great. There were definitely years where that was not the case, but it really is, and people love it and get a lot out of it.
Yeah, we modify ours from time to time, just on which traditions we're doing, actually based on who I have at the house, largely. Mm-hmm. If I have people who are actively committed to living a Messianic life, we'll do more of the Haggadah. Sometimes still not like the whole thing, because like there's some parts of the Haggadot that I'm just like, we're not taking 30 minutes for that. I'm sorry. Like most of you are seasoned enough to know this story where we don't need to spend 30 minutes on that section. We can do a lot of this elsewhere. Same with the numbers. Like the past couple years, we've just had to boot Elijah. Like Elijah doesn't get a place at at the table because we've had the whole table's been filled. So we're just kind of like, sorry, we'll open the door and we'll have Eli come out and look for you. But like we're not. Everyone has and not just like the table, but the coffee table. Like we've had every surface filled with people. So it's and that's important. Like again, going back to that, like don't worry about getting everything just so. Just do as best you can, and adjust it to the life that you are
do
living.
What you can with what's available to you.
Right, exactly.
I think that you have to read a room when you're doing something like that.
Oh yeah.
If you're not reading the room, then you're doing it for yourself.
Right.
Like for instance, if I'm hosting a Seder and I'm like, I don't care who comes, I don't care who's here, I'm going to do it the way I always do it because that's the way I've always done it, then you're doing it for you.
Right.
So let's just say that I had some friends coming and maybe some of them were either curious about being Messianic or maybe even not even believers or something like that. I think traditionally a Seder should be extended. And I would probably tell them that. Say, it is longer than usual. We don't just sit down and then talk for 10 minutes and, whatever and eat. I think there is that. But it's like Eric said, though. You can do a 3-hour Seder or a 2-hour Seder and you can hit all the guideposts. And you might just lose somebody. Oh, you'll get to go to bed and say, oh, I did a Seder just like tradition, and I did all the things that I like to do. But you might have lost somebody.
Yeah.
If they're like, my God, what are we doing? So I think there has to be a balance there. I want to be careful because then it's like, I don't want it to sound like, no, you just need to, otherwise it's just, hey, happy Passover, everybody, now let's eat. No, you have to tell the story and you have to get through that. And there has to be some extension and stuff. But I'm with you. I'm kind of like, we're not spending 30 minutes on this if we have 15 kids. Which at the last Seder we led, there was almost 10 kids. And I'm like, this ain't going to be a 2-hour Seder. This ain't happening.
Yeah. Because there's a lot you can do. Like you can, like a lot of the singing and everything, you can put more of an emphasis on that.
On that kind of stuff.
Because the kids really like that.
Yeah, it's very, very life-giving.
And then they're remembering it.
Right.
And then you're actually fulfilling what the commandment is, which is to impart it to your children so they'll remember it.
But if you want it to fall flat, don't think about any of the people in the room and just go on autopilot.
Just read your 30-page pamphlet.
Read your 30-page pamphlet. Well, this is what we do. This is what we do. This is how it is. And then it's like, right, but you might have just lost somebody, or somebody had to get up and go chase one of their kids.
Oh, you'll lose me if you get up at a Seder to read a 30-page pamphlet.
Yeah, you're going to lose me.
I'm already checked out.
You're going to see that. You're going to see this.
Raise the glass.
And it's important to remember that Passover Seder is supposed to be an interactive family event.
Right. It's a meal.
Right. That everybody is a part of.
Right.
That the children are a part of. That you sing Dayenu together. You say the 4 questions. You participate in the different elements. You do all the things. So it shouldn't be just somebody standing up and telling people things, but it should be people reading the Haggadah together to go through the whole Seder. Whether it's a short half-an-hour Haggadah or it's a 3-hour Haggadah, it should be something that everybody is doing together and involved in actively. And we, at our family Seder, we always have the children. Even little Jackson, the youngest, participates by reading through the Haggadah with us.
Yeah, and it's really beautiful. I love the Seder, and I love the interactiveness and the extended parts of the Seder. I love the idea of, you do have to, there is that time you have to spend before the meal and things like that to really get there. I'm just saying that I'm not so staunch on the tradition of the Seder that I don't adapt, when I see that, that depending on who's there, especially if you have if you have someone who's like, I've never done this before, what's this and the other, is like, okay, so if you want them to get the message of the gospel and the Messiah, what's more important? That's my thing. So we're Messianic, right? So what's more important, the Seder experience or the gospel? Well, the gospel is more important. So, and the gospel works in the construct of the Seder. It's essentially the gospel. That's the thing. You don't have to I don't have to preach a salvation message.
Right.
You tell it in the Seder.
Right.
It works so well. The Passover is so set up for the gospel.
Yeah.
So
and you can do that effectively in an hour.
And God's work God's work, the way He put that together, will go to work for you.
Right.
So I don't need to do that. I don't need to. So you can let it go to work for you. But my thing is too is that if it's let's spend 30 minutes on a shank bone, or let's spend 30 minutes on an egg and a piece of lettuce, you're not gonna. If you got someone who's they're not gonna get that gospel.
Well, one of the things I love about the Haggadah and the Seder in general is that there are aspects to the Seder. There are parts of the Haggadah, the telling of the Seder that makes no sense outside of the gospel, right? It's there. It's in the traditional Seder, right, but there's no logical reasoning for it outside of the influence of the gospel. And so, like Rabbi Toby was saying, like it's ready-made for it. But even at that, the Haggadah, as it's laid out traditionally, and that's not saying that like you have to go through this really extensive, long, whatever, and depending on what flavor of Judaism, what denomination of Judaism you come from, Seders could be 6 hours long, or they could be an hour and a half long. And there's a lot of variance even within the various traditions of Judaism of how it's done. But there are key elements in the Haggadah that make no sense in the Haggadah outside of the influence of the gospel. So it's built in there that there's this beauty of the Seder, and I think it's the providence of God, if you want to call it that or whatever, that it's there when those that developed the Haggadah typically were not followers of Yeshua, yet Yeshua is visibly obvious in the Haggadah. Right. And I love that. I think that's one of the most amazing realities. And like when we do our big congregational Seder, we go out of our way to draw those realities out and point out that this is here. And some of them, it's believed that maybe Peter and others influenced their inclusion into the Seder and such in the early days of the body. But nonetheless, it's still really neat to see that reality is built into I always joke around and say it's one of those things where it's almost like God had a plan. Yeah. It was kind of like God knew what He was doing, who to thunk it, right? But it's just really cool to see that there. Now, this brings up this conversation of being willing to kind of adapt our rigidity in the Seder and the reading of the Haggadah in our Seders for the audience that's with us, right? Read the room was one of the things that Rabbi Toby and Rabbi Jonathan had mentioned. Be willing to adapt, be willing to flow with that. The fact of the matter is, this is something Messianic Judaism can be better about in general with Pesach, is there are a lot of people, and this was something Rabbi Jonathan and I were briefly talking about before we started recording, and that I know he wanted to dive into a conversation on, is how we treat the rest of the body of Messiah. Like a lot of times people in Messianic Judaism kind of have this I've arrived mentality. Like I finally found the real truth, and all the truth I heard from all the rest of the body was a lie. And so there's a lot of people in Messianic Judaism or on the fringes like Hebrew Roots and so on that they look down on with almost disdain the church because the church celebrates Easter instead of Passover. And there's this, you're lesser of a believer than I am because I'm doing the real thing. I'm doing the right thing. Right. And you're doing Easter, and there's almost this vilification of the church world this time of year. Yeah. As we're prepping for Pesach, they're prepping for Easter. Right. There's almost this vilification that it can occur of the church from Messianic Judaism. And I think personally, I think it's hideous.
It is. Like
I see the historical development of how the church and Judaism separated, and I can see the historical development of kind of Easter really developed in a way to replace Passover within the church, and I can see the kind of anti-Semitic roots in that to some degree. But at the same time, in the 21st century, when Messianic Judaism has been revived, for us to have a negative attitude at the torchbearers of the body of Messiah for the last 1800 years, for us to have a negative attitude because they're not doing things our way, I feel like can be really problematic and create massive barriers between us and the rest of the body of Messiah. And so I know that was something you wanted to talk about, Jonathan. So
yeah, it's both sides are missing half.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because I a lot of people come to Messianic Judaism, like you said, or some form of Torah observance or pursuance, and they think I've arrived, and then they forget everything that they may have done before if they were raised in a Christian environment, whatever. Because the emphasis are different in the two different worlds. In the Messianic world, we have this big emphasis on Passover and the meal, and we'll even touch on the last Seder. But then, when it comes to crucifixion and resurrection, it gets much quieter. And I think that's anecdotal. I would even say it's empirical. For all of us could agree that the movement is not as focused on those things, and largely because there is sort of this push, again, going back to identity crises that we've talked to in the past, about trying to figure out who we are.
Well, I would say there's definitely a focus on the crucifixion, because that's built into the Seder in a lot of ways.
I'm just saying
the resurrection for sure. It's like a back burner kind of topic.
Anecdotally, in my own experience, when it comes to the amount of sermons, songs, and focus and discussion on those things, they're not as prevalent as they are in the church world. And that's the opposite. The Christian world is they don't remember the Passover. They don't remember that the Last Supper, as it's called in church circles, the Last Supper was a Seder, Passover Seder. But it is entirely focused on the final days of Yeshua's ministry and eventual crucifixion and resurrection. So, and how do those all how do they all come together? Well, I think we obviously first have to learn and understand the history behind both of those events. If your initial inclination is to just go, oh, that's pagan, well, one, you're wrong in both ways. You're wrong historically, and you're wrong just in the spirit. I don't know how you can look at someone celebrating the resurrection in mass. I mean, remember, sometimes in historically Christian nations, we like to champion the idea that America is a Christian nation. I would disagree, because there are whole countries that gather in the streets to celebrate the resurrection, whether or not they're religious the rest of the year or not. It's like an obligatory thing that you are going out, and no matter how faithful you are at all, you are celebrating the resurrection of this person that lived, so many years ago, and now sits at the right hand of the Father in glory. That's a big thing. So you need to quit that, because that doesn't make any sense. And there's almost no historical proof that it's tied to pagan religions, ideologies. A lot of the things that get mentioned in memes and on blogs and stuff, it's dubious, subjective at best, most of it. Instead, what and again, I said at the beginning that my opinion, and this was rather controversial, if the calendars line up, and they don't always. I think this year is one of the first years where the calendars actually kind of are close together, where Passover and Easter are kind of within a couple weeks of each other.
A couple of years ago, it actually lined up where
the same
Easter
week
was on the right day.
Yeah. It just depends, because it'll fluctuate from year to year. But if you have a year where it's close, and you are friends with local churches, especially churches that may really get into the Easter week, and I'm talking if they really they're doing a Palm Sunday, before celebrating the entry into Jerusalem. There's a lot there that's prophetic and powerful that a lot of people, especially if you didn't come from a Christian background and just became messianic from atheism or whatever, that you actually miss out, because it doesn't get talked a lot about. I would encourage people, if the calendars are close enough, go with your friends to a Palm Sunday. Go and learn what it means to celebrate and read about the final days of Yeshua's ministry, entering into Jerusalem and focusing on that story that week. And then when you get to the later mid portion of that week, then you celebrate your Passover Seder, and you're bolstered with a greater participation in actually, in a way, kind of replicating the things that would have happened during that week. The people greeted him with cloaks and palm fronds as he rode into the city, shouting, "Hosanna, Hosanna! Save us." And then if you have a church that does it right, and you don't do a resurrection service, join your friends for a resurrection service. We're friends with plenty of churches. If we thought what they were doing was wrong or sinful or pagan, we wouldn't be friends with them. Not in the sense of doing things together jointedly and stuff. And again, it's different when the two holidays are a month apart. I don't think it makes much sense to go out of your way to do that. But if they're close enough, my encouragement with people is, well, one, to shut up. And then two, to go actually join your believing friends in celebrating the resurrection. And maybe they'll join you for Passover. Invite them. Invite them to come and taste of something additional to the week before the crucifixion.
I think that, I don't know if this is going to come out right, but I think Messianic Judaism has a burden because it's because it's Jewish, and that's not going to go away, right? It's going to be distinct. It's the Messianic Judaism and the church. It's one body, right. And I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, but there is distinctions within that body, right? Messianic Judaism is distinct from, say, the church, even though we're all part of the same body. But here's the problem. Be very careful about this. I think in some cases, Messianic Judaism doesn't carry that burden properly, in the sense that it will veer away from things like you're talking about, like the resurrection and stuff, or things like that. Like you're saying that it's kind of quiet on the front in the Seder about the resurrection, or really anything in general, universally speaking, anything that they think might be churchy, or what they would label that's churchy or something like that.
Right.
Here's the problem. The problem is that when I listen to some Messianic teachings, and I'm like, and it's so devoid of anything Spirit of God, because it's all about how to be a better Jew. And I think, what are you doing? Wait a minute. Here's the problem. I think whether a person, I don't know if I'm making sense here. I think whether a person is Messianic Jewish or a church-going Gentile, when people go into places, they want to meet with God. They want to know God loves them. Right. They want to know that God's going to daily bear their burdens. Right. They want to feel His intimate embrace. Everybody wants that. I think people who come hungry for God don't want to learn how to be how do I become a better practicing Jewish person? I think that the gospel gets diminished when that's the focus. And I've heard some, Rabbi Jacob Rosenberg is one that's you could put his messages in a church too, and they would translate.
They would land. Yeah.
They would land. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Now I feel like it's starting to open up a little bit. Okay, so to a degree, I think whether you're Messianic or church, there should be distinctions, but the one God, one Spirit, one Messiah, we should be overlapping and landing as well. There should be messages from a church that should be able to land in a synagogue, and there should be messages in a synagogue that should land in a church. Right. And I'm telling you, I was listening to one recently. It's if you'd said this in a church, they would not know what you're talking about, because, again, I think I mentioned it in a recent, because I think there are certain voices in the Messianic movement that are going back and they're retconning. Well, I know the Bible said this, but here's actually what it said. Well, I know Yeshua said, "For God so loved the world," but he really wasn't talking about the world. He was talking about this part of Judaism. I'm like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
He said, "For God so loved the world." That's what he said. He didn't mean the world. And when you say you're saved, you're not really saved, because that's really problematic. I'm like, this wouldn't land this shouldn't land anywhere. But I'm saying that I think Messianic Judaism has a problem because of they lean too much into the religiosity of Judaism, and it starts to, and that's how I think it starts to kind of bend away from the gospel because they don't want to be like a church. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think we have an aversion to.
Sorry, hold that thought though.
Yeah.
That's honestly a big part of why and I'm not saying this like it's an endemic reality, but it is a pretty big problem. That's a big part of the reason why there are so many who come into Messianic Judaism, especially those from the nations, but I've seen some who are Jewish as well that come into Messianic Judaism and they ultimately end up leaving Messianic Judaism and converting to traditional Judaism, and typically within some Orthodox denomination like Chabad or what have you, because they and Rabbi Toby and I have talked about this before, they end up placing Judaism on the pedestal of Yeshua. And so it's not even about Yeshua anymore. It's I've got to know more about Judaism. They begin to idolize Judaism, and they want to chase that down, and to hell with Yeshua is kind of the mindset. Like he just goes to the back burner, and it doesn't. And then ultimately he's rejected altogether because it was always about Judaism, not about Yeshua. And so, yeah, I just want to throw that in there real quick. It becomes a real problem.
Yeah, I think that we forget sometimes that there's problems with Messianic Judaism. And what I mean by that is...
That's why we exist.
Yeah, we don't. Yeah, it's in our name.
Yeah. What I mean by that is I absolutely agree that we should be celebrating the resurrection. I think that a large portion of the Christian body has allowed other stuff to become a focus of that celebration. In other words, Easter eggs and all of that stuff. And so we stay away from the Christian thing, and we stay away from the worldly stuff that's been added to it, instead of shedding it, peeling it back to get to the resurrection, to get to what is.
Egg?
Yeah, we tend to have no problem with celebrating Hanukkah, although much of the Jewish world doesn't focus on the dedication of the temple. It's all about the gifts, the presents, and the menorah.
Right.
And the story gets backburnered. Yeah. And the same way with other things that we do. Purim, we're about to celebrate Purim. And Purim in the Jewish world has largely become a time to dress up and eat hamantashen, and
get drunk.
And get drunk. And there's nothing wrong with the hamantashen and those kind of things, because they're used to tell the story. But when they become the story instead of the actual story, it becomes a problem. And so we have an aversion to those things in the Christian world, but we don't seem to have an aversion having our people dress up in costumes on Purim. And even at our congregation, our people are going to dress up in biblical costumes. They're not going to be in superheroes and stuff, but biblical costumes. And that's part of what we do. And we eat hamantashen, and we do that. But if it becomes the focus on the dressing up and the costumes instead of on God's deliverance of the Jewish people, if Hanukkah becomes more about the presents and the latkes than it is the dedication of the temple, and likewise, if resurrection becomes about Easter eggs and those things rather than the resurrection, we've lost it. Right. And I think that because Hanukkah and Purim are Jewish things, we kind of accept the worldliness that was added to it because it's Jewish worldliness, as opposed to Christian worldliness. But the problem is that when we reject the Christian worldliness of the resurrection, we've also, in many cases, diminished the resurrection to where it's not even a part of our. We mention it in Passover briefly. But we don't celebrate a special service to celebrate the resurrection.
Right. And some synagogues do that.
Right, and some synagogues do, but too many don't, because they don't want to be confused with the celebration of the worldly stuff that was added to, and the stuff that was added to by the Catholic Church, and the stuff that was added to by the Protestant Church, and all of that stuff, instead of peeling back that stuff and saying there was a purpose for this resurrection happening on first fruits. There was a purpose in this being a sign of the Messiah. This is part of, if it wasn't for the resurrection, the death would have no meaning because everybody dies. Mm-hmm. And so we just have to understand it's possible to go to a church on Resurrection Sunday and enjoy and celebrate the resurrection, even if there are trappings of other things that you wouldn't agree with there, right. The same way that you could go to a synagogue on Purim and read the Megillah, read the story of Esther and Mordecai, and not accept or not hold to those things. Now I am going to say that it would make me horribly uncomfortable to go to a place that was overwhelmingly sure. Easter. Yeah. On the resurrection. So I would choose one that was focused on the resurrection.
And you can, and typically I recommend like high Protestantism when it comes to those things. So if you can find like a non-rainbow flag Anglican church, then like you're probably in good standing, because like the Easter trappings there are mostly going to be like flowers and, you know, mm-hmm. greenery, you know, things that are...
Yeah, so again, we need to be careful that we don't accuse the Christians of doing the same thing we're doing, but doing it differently, and so they're evil while we're not.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we need to guard our hearts against entering into those things that we shouldn't be a part of.
And as we get ready to close, I want to bring this up because this is, you mentioned something that I talk about pretty regularly. I'm not a huge fan of the cross like as jewelry and imagery and icon and so on. Not because I think it's wrong to wear one, but because I think there's such the cross was a means to an end. Like I've asked people before, if he had been killed by firing squad, would we all wear little golden rifles around our neck? Or if he'd been killed in the electric chair, would we all wear little... Like it was a means to an end. It wasn't... there is power in the death, right? I get that, but it was a means to an end. As Rabbi Eric said, if he hadn't resurrected, the death wouldn't have meant anything, because, you know, death is death, unfortunately. But he resurrected. That's where the beauty of it, that's the promise we have, is the promise of new life in Messiah because of his resurrection. When we go through a mikvah, through immersion, we're participating in the death, burial, and resurrection of Yeshua. If we could come up with a unified image, icon for the resurrection or whatever, like an open tomb. I know there's like jewelry out there or whatever with the open tomb on it. Like if we could come up with something we could all...
Studios made one.
Yeah. If we could come up with something we could all get behind, dude, I'd wear that in a heartbeat. Like that'd be awesome. I'm here for it. But at the same time, while we don't, I don't like the cross for what it, that it's kind of become idolized in itself in a lot of ways. But in the same way, we hyperfixate on the death in Messianic Judaism, right? Because of the Passover Seder, we're adamant we got to do a Passover Seder. This is what Rabbi Jonathan was talking about. We're adamant we got to do a Passover. It's got to be done a certain way. It's got to be, but we're so hyperfixated in Messianic Judaism on the death, right, that we don't generally do anything for the resurrection. Like we may mention it in passing in our Passover Seder, but we don't do anything often for the resurrection. And a big part of that is because there is that, well, I don't want to cross the line and I don't want to make it look like we're trying to, do what the church does or whatever else. But the fact of the matter is, we believe in Yeshua. Like, look, people, you got to understand, the thing that differentiates Messianic Judaism from the rest of the Jewish world is Yeshua. I mean, that's pretty much it. If it wasn't for our faith in Yeshua, the rest of the Jewish world would gladly accept us with wide arms. Like, that's the problem. That's the issue, is that we believe in Yeshua. That's the dividing line. We're not going to get over that. That's not going to get fixed today. That's not going to get fixed immediately. That's not going away. That's the core of who we are. Not Judaism. Yeshua is the core of who we are. Right. And so if Yeshua is that dividing barrier between us and the rest of the Jewish world, what difference does it make if they don't like that we do a resurrection service or something to commemorate the resurrection? What difference does it make? If they don't like it, if they think it's weird, if they think it's too Christian, guess what? They don't like us doing Passover Seders either, right? They don't like us, in their perspective, forcing Jesus into the Passover Seder. Now he's there. He put himself there, not us. We're not forcing. But that's their perspective. We're forcing Jesus into the Passover Seder. They don't like that. So what difference does it make, right? Why are we so worried? And I feel like to some degree, we are so worried about not offending the Jewish world that we are willing to offend God. And I think that's problematic, right? The resurrection is where our faith is. If he had just been another Jewish guy that died, it wouldn't have been the same thing. But he's a Jewish guy that died and was resurrected again. That's where the beauty is. That's where the power is. That's where our hope is. So a resurrection service is very much fitting. And guess what? You can find a way. If you just have to do everything hyper-Jewish, you can find a way to do it Jewish. It's okay. It doesn't have to be a thing. But
yeah, after all, the resurrection is a very Jewish thing. We say the Amidah and the Gibor Adonai is all about the resurrection. So we don't have to be Christian, so to speak, to talk about the resurrection. Yeah. And it is a Jewish thing.
Yep. And one of the complaints about Easter in Messianic Judaism, honestly, is that it's just not at the right time. And that's okay. The church does their thing. They've got their calendar. That's fine. But guess what? We can do it. And we know the right time. It's not that complicated. Like this year, it would be on the evening, somewhere after sundown on the 15th to sunrise on the 16th. That period of time is where the resurrection would occur. That's a Tuesday night and a Wednesday morning. Somewhere in that period is where the resurrection occurred. Perfect. Go for it. Do it. Do something. Like our congregational Seder is that Tuesday night, and we'll do something to point out and draw on the beauty of the resurrection in our Seder. But have a service. It's not that complicated.
Yeah, and if you don't even if you can't do it on the day, still celebrate that it happened, that an event took place. Yeah. So do it during the Passover season, the actual time. And if the church is doing it at a different time, allow them the grace to celebrate the resurrection to the knowledge that they have until such a time as God does what the Scripture says, which is to bring the unity of the faith to all believers.
And also understand that, like, in giving them grace, it's not like they just walled off to do whatever for whatever's sake. That these are calendars that were determined by emperors and popes, people who had vast swaths of power over the lives of people in over miles of territory. Like, these were not just like, the church just decided. It's like, no, like, these were calendars that were drafted commissioned by rulers, created by mathematicians, people who were able to, say like, well, this is how we think the days work, yada, yada, yada. To include the Hillel calendar, the rabbis and sages who developed the Hillel too, that we use as the Jewish calendar today. And it just so happens that there are 3 different popular calendars being used, and that be a little gracious towards one another.
And as we close, don't, in Messianic Judaism, don't, for the sake of trying not to offend the Jewish community, go out of your way to offend your brothers and sisters in Messiah.
Right. And also remember that none of us are saying that you should participate in unbiblical activities.
Yeah, Easter egg hunts are not on the agenda.
Yeah. Right. But don't lose the resurrection in the egg hunt.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to the MessianTics podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.